scheduled. So Shane is going to be speaking for a while, and then we have some questions for him. And if you folks have questions, you can write them in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to them. Thank you so much. Martha, all you.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Martha Conley. I'm co-chair of Pennsylvanians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty Pittsburgh, along with Marshall Diane, who's also an attorney and federal defender in Pittsburgh. Our co-hosts include this evening Amnesty International, Witness to Innocence, the Thomas Merton Center Pittsburgh, the Atlantic Center for Capital Representation, the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, and Villanovans for Life, Red Letter Christians, Gray Nuns of the Sacred Heart. And we appreciate all of them for co-hosting with us this evening. As Kathleen said, we are delighted to welcome Shane Claiborne this evening to talk about his book, Executing Grace, How the Death Penalty Killed Jesus and Why It's Killing Us. Shane Claiborne has been described as a Christian and social activist. He's a graduate of Eastern University, where he studied sociology and youth ministry. He's done graduate work at the Princeton Theological Seminary, and he's now part of the Alternative Seminary in Philadelphia. He has worked alongside Mother Teresa in Calcutta, India, and he is also a Red Letter Christian. I have to say that our first book this is the first book that we've had a book talk about that's based on a religious theme. Most of the other books that we've sponsored have been secular books. I think it's important for abolitionists to know how to talk to people, particularly Christians, who are in favor of the death penalty. And so we think that Shane's book certainly has covered that territory. The first thing I wanted to ask you about, Shane, I noticed in your book, you've written on the bottom of each page, from page 1 to page 287, names. Could you tell us what those names are, and are they in any particular order?
Yeah, well, thanks again for hosting this, and for all the sponsors and everybody listening in. And it's just wonderful to have this important conversation. Yeah, the names. So what we did is, I wanted to think about the humanity of everyone, of those who are victims of violence or murder victims' family members, but also, in this particular book on the death penalty, to remember all those who have been executed. And so those are just the names of kind of what we call the modern era, right? Since the executions resumed after a hiatus, kind of the Supreme Court validated the death penalty and allowed states to move forward. So it's about 1,500 names that are at the bottom of each page of the book.
Are they in any particular order?
I think that they're in the order that they were executed, but I just remember looking at that list and thinking, every one of these folks, is a child of God, made in the image of God, and many of them did something terrible. But, as our brother Brian Stevenson says, we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. And so, I wanted to remember that these are not just murderers. I mean, they're also people who were wrongfully convicted that are on that list. There's folks that, have many layers of complexity to their own stories, that ended with the tragedy of a state execution.
I noted in your book that you were born in the Bible Belt, and at one point, apparently, you were in favor of the death penalty. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey to abolition?
Yeah, absolutely. I've always, one of my friends says, I'm always passionate, even when I'm wrong. And I mean, I kind of grew up in the charismatic church in the Bible Belt. So I had this kind of fiery faith that was very passionate. And I for a lot of my life was really convinced that the death penalty is ordained by God, or that it's, God's intention. It's rooted in scripture. And it was when I went back and circled back and really started looking at scripture more deeply. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth idea. And Jesus, the whole story of Jesus. I was also Methodist for most of my life. And the Methodist Church has one of the most powerful statements on the death penalty, which is that capital punishment denies the power of Christ to redeem, restore, and transform every person. So, it was sometime later that I really began to think about that. And I also, Martha, we grew up talking about being pro-life, but we really narrowly thought about that mostly in terms of abortion. And, I think we would be more accurate to say we're pro-birth than pro-life, because there's all these other issues that weren't even on my radar, and the death penalty was one of them. I grew up very passionate on the issue of abortion, but things like gun violence and war and the death penalty weren't really, I didn't connect it to my faith, until a little bit later.
I was interested in what you talked about in the book about misconceptions about the Old Testament and the death penalty. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, boy, there's so much as you start to really lean in. You start to, I at least started to see a lot of the holes in my own theology. Starting with the inaugural murder of Cain and Abel. This is one of the first stories we have in the scripture. And interestingly enough, it's also the first time that the word sin is used. We sometimes think of sin as the original sin in the Garden of Eden, but actually the first time the word is used is when Cain kills his brother Abel. But it's interesting that God's response to that sin is not capital punishment. It's not to kill Cain, but he allows Cain to live, and he's certainly faces consequences. He's kind of exiled for that, but he's allowed to live. He's allowed to have a family and eventually to live his life. And you keep reading, and then you see that Moses, who I grew up thinking of as one of the iconic heroes of our faith, and yet in Exodus he kills someone. Moses committed murder. You keep reading in these stories. Violence is all there, and you see God kind of working through the cracks of everything. David, who I learned in Sunday school, was a man after God's own heart. But he had some really terrible, dark moments of his life where he raped Bathsheba and had her husband Uriah killed in the battlefield to cover up his kind of train wreck of sins and evil. And he goes on to have this powerful moment of repentance and write so many of the Psalms. Saul of Tarsus, who wrote half the New Testament, was by every definition a religious extremist. He has this powerful conversion. So that's why in my book I said, if we believe that murderers are beyond redemption, we could rip out half the Bible because it was written by them. Or as Bono, the singer of U2, says, the fact that the Bible's filled, just full of messed up people used to disturb me, but now I find it a great source of comfort. Because you realize, if God's grace was big enough for David and Saul and Moses, then it's big enough for me too. And, with the scriptures, though, you start to see the death penalty in the Hebrew scripture. But what's interesting is that, capital murder was not the only death-worthy crime. There's dozens and dozens of death-worthy crimes according to the Hebrew scripture. Working on the Sabbath day was a capital crime. Disrespecting your parents, all sorts of sorcery, and even in the United States, we had some of these on the books, as you well know, the Salem witch trials. So we've evolved in how we think about it. But what's also interesting, and what some of my rabbinical friends have helped me with, I think the Jewish community understands this a lot better than a lot of the Christian community with the text, is that there were dozens of prohibitions to stop executions, to make sure that they almost never happened. And the rabbis used to say, if we have one execution in 70 years, it's too many. There's something wrong with our society, and execution's not going to solve it. So there were all these interruptions, and things like circumstantial evidence wasn't even admitted. So it was totally a different concept and almost never used, even though you had all these emphasis on, what's right to do and wrong to do and the consequences that they're worthy of. But here's the other one, is one of the most ancient frameworks for justice that we have in the world is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And it was, thousands of years old. It's called lex talionis, and it's where we get the concept of retaliation from. And it did allow for, this way of thinking about justice, said you could reciprocate the harm, but you had to do it identical to how you were harmed. So that's why, if you poked out my right eye, the law would say literally it had to be your right eye. I couldn't poke out your left eye or both your eyes. I couldn't, break your legs. It had to be reciprocal harm. But we've kind of distorted that, and we've used it as a license for retaliation rather than what it was meant to do, which was to limit harm. It was to stop the spiral of violence. And as we know, one punch comes another, and then things escalate. A tweet turns into a fight that turns into it's just like that. Spiraling violence is what it was meant to stop. And so we might think of it as an eye for an eye, no more,
Right.
But then, one of my rabbi friends, he says, but the interesting thing is that you guys have Jesus. As Christians, you also have Jesus that you are looking to. And Jesus said it clearly. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He said, Moses told you this, but I tell you this. And he goes on to even teach that you may have a legal right to return harm, but that doesn't mean you should. It doesn't mean it's the best that we can do. As our mothers and grandmothers have taught us, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And so we don't rate people who rape to try to show that rape is wrong. We have this idea that I think is at the heart of the Christian faith, especially in many faiths, I think share a version of this, is that we should not mirror the evil. And that's exactly what the death penalty does, right? It ends up mirroring the very evil that we're trying to heal the world of. So that's, it's also interesting that so many Jewish folks are against the death penalty because they have a more robust reading of scripture. And, they've told me over and over, it's the Christians that are kind of misusing the Hebrew text to try to justify the death penalty. And that's ironic, because we've also got Jesus as kind of out in the Christian mind as the fulfillment of that law. Wasn't abolishing it, but the fulfillment is that you don't even need to return harm for harm.
Yeah, I have a T-shirt that says, an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. And so that was really a revelation to me. I didn't realize that that was an improvement over what had been going on in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really helpful for a lot of folks to think more deeply about that, because when you ask Christians and non-Christians alike, what is a Bible verse that that is one of the most quoted Bible verses in the entire world. It's one of the most well-known, and also I think one of the most misunderstood. You even hear it a lot of times in the Bible Belt from prosecuting attorneys in death penalty trials.
Wow. You have a chapter entitled "The Most Famous Execution in History" about the crucifixion. I have to confess that I had never really thought of the crucifixion in terms of the death penalty for some reason. Christians, maybe that's why Christians can be for the death penalty. Maybe we should substitute the word death penalty for crucifixion. And, I guess that it's an example of a botched execution, maybe one of the first documented botched executions. Do you think that that's a valid point, or should we continue to call it a crucifixion?
I think it's so important to think about Jesus's execution is exactly what it was, is it was a form of public humiliation. It was also, as James Cone says, a public service announcement. Don't do what this person did. It was a display of state power. I mean, it was more than that. As a Christian, I believe it was there's a depth to it but what folks like James Cone and others are building on his work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he does say, you know, here's a man who's hanging on a cross, hung on wood, and many African Americans, you know, throughout U.S. history have really seen the liberation of that Jesus was among those who were lynched, and have used language that shows what Jesus did was put death on display, not to glorify it, but to subvert it with love and forgiveness and an empty tomb. And so Jesus is absorbing that violence, you know, and really showing us another way forward, showing us what God's love looks like in contrast to the powers and principalities of this world. So, I mean, one of the things that we've been doing at Red Letter Christians through this season of Advent, which means the coming, and it's, you know, something that many Christians have celebrated for hundreds of years, is this season before Christmas, remembering that Jesus came as one of us, and Jesus was born as a homeless baby. Jesus was born with brown skin as a Palestinian Jewish refugee, and Jesus was condemned and executed by the state. So I remember sitting with a mother as her son was facing execution, and she said, I take great courage from the fact that God knows what it feels like to sit in this space, to watch your son be brutally killed. And I mean, Jesus even, I think, knew that the depth of that loneliness, to the point that he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I would suggest, you know, especially to my Christian friends, that naming the execution, the crucifixion of Jesus as an execution, adds a layer of depth to the theology, to say, this is what happened, is that God stood in solidarity with the disinherited people of the world, as Howard Thurman says, with those that have been the crucified peoples of the world, as Latin American theologian says. God is leaning into the suffering and to the margins. That's what happens on the cross, and God subverting our principalities and powers. And you know, the crucifixions were so common that we sometimes think of Jesus as kind of this exemplary model, but historians said that crucifixions happened sometimes 100 at a time. And one historian said that some days there were so many crosses on the horizon that you couldn't even enjoy a good sunset. So this was a form of imperial torture, and that's what Jesus endured. And so I think it has a lot of layers of depth for how we think about the death penalty today. You know, as we're gathered around, many of us every Sunday, remembering the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus, it should do something to us, to reorient us, I think, towards capital punishment, and also just towards violence in general, that this is what Jesus did, is join the suffering by even offering his own life. And now I think anytime we try to defend the death penalty, we really contradict and betray the very reason that Jesus did all that.
You talked about how the early Christians were very much opposed to the death penalty. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really admire about the early Christians, like this, say the first 300 years of the church, is this ethic of life that was comprehensive and they were a force for life, and they were fueled by this passion that every person is made in the image of God. And that's why they stood unilaterally against war. You don't see any Christian the first 300 years that's defending violence or war in any form. They spoke against the gladiatorial games because they thought it was this kind of grotesque celebration of violence in their particular culture. They stood against, they spoke against abortion. They spoke against the death penalty in particular. I mean, it also didn't hurt that they were victims of the death penalty, but they were passionate about it. And one of the early bishops, I think he said it so well. He said, when an individual, this is Cyprian, in like the 4th century, he said, when a person, an individual kills another individual, we call it evil, as we should. But why then do we sanctify it when the state does it in mass and we call it holy, or we call it justice? We call something evil good when the state does it rather than an individual. And he said, it's wrong to kill. No matter who's doing it, whether it's a criminal or a governor or a president, it is wrong for any person to take life which God has created as holy and sacred.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about innocence. Your chapter 7 is filled with rather startling statistics on the death penalty. 6 years ago, when your book was published, there were, I think, 146 exonerations from death row, and now the figure is up to 190 exonerations, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. I think the use of DNA has made people wake up to the fact that there are innocent people in danger of being executed, and people on death row. They're not all exonerated by DNA evidence. But it underscores the fact that people have indeed been convicted and are sitting on death row when they're innocent. So I think the fact that these numbers are increasing is part of the reason why the numbers of executions have declined. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but that's certainly one of them. I think people are taking innocence seriously now more than ever.
Absolutely. And I have many friends that still may be a little unconvinced on some of the theology and stuff, but they just come to the point that, like, our state is never going to get it right every time. Like, I mean, it's why there's a powerful movement of conservatives concerned about the death penalty, is because there's sort of this distrust of state power, and these are broken, fallible human institutions. And so can we trust them with the irreversible power of life and death? I mean, you don't get a second chance at that. And when you look at the track record, it's horrifying, right? To think that I had to change this statistic, Martha, since the book came out, because like you mentioned, it was like 140, 150 when I wrote this just a few years ago, and now it's almost 200. So I used to say for every 10 executions, there's one exoneration, but now the statistic is for every 8 executions, there's one exoneration. So if you imagine, every 9 planes that are taking off, one of them crashes, like we would be like, oh, we got a problem, like stop all planes, right? And yet that's our track record. I mean, that's absolutely horrifying to think of. So, Sister Helen Prejean says so well. She says, sometimes the question is not, do they deserve to die, but do we deserve to kill? I mean, individually, I believe, let the one who's without sin cast the first stone. None of us are without sin, but also our state has a terrible track record of this. And we know, that even though in our minds, we've sometimes conditioned ourselves to think we're doing this just in the worst of the worst cases. But the truth is that, we're not, it's not the atrocity of the crime that is really what leads to a death sentence. It's arbitrary things like the resources of the defendant. The race of the victim is a major part of this. Race still plays a major role, right? That where I think we can, one of the things that we're all very careful to talk about is that you can't divorce the death penalty from our history of race in America. And the same states that held on to slavery the longest are the states that are holding on to the death penalty. Where lynchings were happening 100 years ago is exactly where executions continue to happen today. I literally have a map that kind of lays those on top of each other so that you can see, so it is stunning, that history. And you're right, the DNA has been a game changer in some ways, but there's other cases like Derek Jameson, who's a dear friend of mine. He's a part of Witness to Innocence. In his case, it was prosecutorial misconduct. He was wrongfully convicted, spent almost 20 years on death row, saw dozens of his friends executed, was traumatized by that, was hours from his own execution when it was stopped, and the state was forced to release over 30 pieces of evidence that proved his innocence. They had all the evidence that he was innocent. And there's so many cases like that where it wasn't DNA, it was withholding evidence just in order to have expediency and have someone convicted rather than accuracy and having the right person convicted for the crime.
Yeah, Cameron Todd Willingham in Texas, junk science. They relied on junk science, and he actually was executed. And Troy Davis, the same thing. So they try to sometimes deny it, but it's pretty evident that innocent people have been executed.
Yeah, and even now we've got cases. There's a number of really compelling innocence cases that I've been connected to. One of them is Rodney Reed in Texas, and interestingly enough, they won't test the DNA on the main piece of evidence that they have. If you really dig into the case, there's so many things that were wrong with it, namely that it seems pretty obvious that most evidence is pointing to a former police officer that likely committed the murder and was later convicted for assaulting someone in his car. And Rodney and this police officer were dating the same woman when she was killed. The officer's car disappeared. They have this one piece of evidence and they won't test the DNA on it because even with that, the resources that we have, we could be more, we should be doing everything that we can to make sure that folks are innocent until proven guilty. And also it means that someone's free for a crime that they were not held accountable to.
Right, exactly. You also talked about putting a face on the condemned, and that was instrumental in changing your mind about the death penalty. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the first people I met, because I think stories change us. The book is filled with lots of different stories because I don't know too many people that argue, lose an argument on theology and, instantly change their mind. I mean, I think that might happen sometimes. We get little hiccups, but I think a lot of times our hearts move before our heads move. And that's one of the things I found, the closer I got to this issue, the more my heart began to change. And one of the folks that I remember, quite early on was Billy Moore, who was convicted of a murder that he committed. And I remember hearing him tell his own story. He came back from war, just like many veterans do, very, very troubled. And he and an Army friend tried to rob a house. He had never had any criminal history, but they went to rob this house and convinced that no one would get hurt, no one would be home, and everything, went haywire, and the homeowner was killed. And Billy was really horrified by what they had done. He confessed to it. He knew he would face the death penalty, and he did. And when I heard him tell his story, he said, if I could have pushed the button on my own execution, I would have done it. He tried to take his own life while he was in prison. So in the middle of all that, there was an interruption, and it came from the victim's family. And they said, listen, we hate what you did. But we also believe that God has a different future for you. And we believe in redemption. We believe in second chances. So they said, we're going to argue against the death penalty, even though you killed our loved one. And they became sort of a surrogate family for him. And they ended up, he said, if I didn't understand the gospel before that, I sure did then, and he got baptized while he was on death row. He eventually was released. This is a really exceptional case where, in part because of the victim's family's advocacy, he is now an ordained minister. And every time he preaches, it goes right to the heart of the gospel, that mercy triumphs over judgment, that Jesus didn't come for the healthy, but for the sick. That's exactly what Jesus himself said. So that, I think it's stories like that where you go, there's the cases of innocence. There's also cases where someone, they are guilty. They committed the crime that they're convicted of. But don't we believe that God's grace has a word in all of this? And that's where it really does break my heart that many of my fellow Christians have been the biggest proponents of the death penalty. And to me, that I really begin to feel that the contradiction of that, in my own life. But I have a lot of patience when I'm talking with folks because I was that person. I was a person that was armed with those Bible verses to argue for the death penalty. And I find that the closer we get to the people, the more that I think our theology isn't just kind of empty words on paper, but you begin to really realize, I've walked with people that I know committed the murder that they're convicted of, but I've seen over 10 years how someone can change and transform. And one of the men that I accompanied, even in the final days of his life before he was executed, he was one of those stories. And he died, singing a song of praise to God, even as he was executed by a fellow governor who claims to be Christian. And that, those collisions for me, kind of really created the kind of fire I have in my bones right now to have conversations just like this one, Martha.
Mm-hmm. You talked also about the toll that executions take on not only on the victim's family, I should say, but also on the executioner. What have you discovered in your journey about that?
Well, the more you think about it, you see how many layers there are in the system of death, right? Because no one wants the full burden of feeling like you are killing someone. It does something to us, I think. We're not made to take the life of other people. And so you can't, and I compare this too, and to Jesus's execution. There's all of these layers that you see, right? Like that are playing a role in it. You've got Judas, his friend that betrays him. You got the Sanhedrin. You've got Caiaphas and Herod, the angry mob, Pontius Pilate washing his hands. They're all kind of passing him around. And then at the end of the day, there's a murder. Jesus is killed, and folks are trying to wash their hands of that. And I think in some ways, like when you look at the modern death penalty, we've got those layers that, attorneys that open the door to death, a jury that together carries the weight of, finding someone guilty, a judge who sentenced them, a governor who kind of, signs the death warrant, a clemency board that often, helps affirm the governor and carry that weight, wardens and prison guards. There's a death team that carries out the execution, even medical folks sometimes that are involved to try to make it feel like a medical procedure. So, all of that to say is that's why I feel like it feels like we have a system that kills, but no one wants to really own the fact that we're taking someone's life. But then at the end of the day, what goes on the death certificate for an executed person is homicide. That's the manner of death. Literally on the death certificate is homicide. And I interviewed some of those folks. One in particular, Ron McAndrew, who was a former prison warden. He's a retired prison warden, but one of his terrible jobs was to oversee executions in Florida. And Ron was haunted by it. I mean, many of these folks, they've gotten to know for years and seen the transformation of their life. They've gotten to know each other, but he carried out these executions by electric chair in Florida, and he was literally haunted. At night, the men would visit him in his sleep. And so Ron went to Texas and kind of was trained in lethal injection, thinking it might be a more sanitized way to carry out executions. But what's interesting is, as they moved from electric chair to lethal injection, he was still haunted. And I'll never forget him saying, there's just no good way to kill someone. No matter how much we try to sanitize it and make it look like a medical ritual or something, like, this is horrific. And Ron still, he's still a very, you do the crime, you should do the time. I think he would call himself a conservative, but he's like, there's something altogether different when it comes to taking someone's life. And I think some of us, we don't really even think about that, all the toll that this takes. Like in Oklahoma right now, 25 executions, what that does, to the people who have to carry those out.
Well, I understand that doctors have refused to participate in execution. So I think a lot of the people who are giving these lethal injections really aren't qualified in some cases, because we've had a lot of botched executions, people who've really suffered because of, the inexperience of people who are supposedly giving the injections.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that I think we all can play a role, and the medical community has had incredible courage on this, especially in North Carolina. There was a movement of medical folks that refused to comply with the execution protocols. And they said, we took an oath to do no harm. We became lawyers, not to take life, but to save lives. And the medical community really supported them in that conviction that they felt. And I think so we can say to those who are a part of this system of death, and many of us are even implicitly in different ways, right? Like, let's all find out a way that we cannot be compliant. And for folks that may find themselves at some layer of complicity in the system as corrections officers or whatever it may be, like sometimes someone just saying with a heartfelt conviction, I cannot do this. I have a conscience and I won't be able to. I mean, people did that all through history, because they had a prophetic vision of where the world's headed and didn't want to be complicit with kind of injustice. So I was just with one of those who's become a dear friend of mine, Adam Luck, who was on the clemency board in Oklahoma. He was actually the chair of the board, appointed by the governor. And the more he looked at these cases and the more he prayed and looked into his own faith, he's a deeply committed Christian. He just said, I started asking, how many innocent people are we willing to sacrifice? He said, I also started thinking about Jesus and what he taught, blessed are the merciful, we'll be shown mercy. And he said, I voted against the executions. And the governor asked him to step down. And he wrote his resignation letter, and they asked him if he would actually say, upon further reflection, I'm no longer, going to serve in this role. And he said, that's not true. He said, I would have served in this role as long as I could. But, interestingly enough, Governor Stitt, even recently, has gone against his own clemency board's recommendation for to not kill James Coddington. And I was with James Coddington right before he was executed. And I mean, if ever there was a case of someone who's remorseful and tried to heal the wounds, I mean, and that's why the clemency board voted against the execution. They voted for mercy, and the governor still carried out the execution. So I think we need those voices of conscience, whether it's doctors and nurses or clemency board members or corrections officers. I even know prison wardens that I probably won't mention by name, but I've gone in and I've said, I'm praying for you. And they said, thank you. You know how these executions take such a toll on us. So I think we just need to kind of keep encouraging and emboldening people that can make a difference.
Yeah. I started visiting death row inmates about 20 years ago. And when I got there, the other inmates pointed out all the innocent people who were on death row. And I was skeptical at first. But now, today, several of those people that I visited are out. They've been exonerated. I think we're up to 11 people in Pennsylvania who've been exonerated from death row. So I think it's extremely important to visit and, and to listen to people and help them if you can. And I think I also think it just helps to visit, because they're so confined.
Yeah,
What do you
I keep
think?
a few things with me, Martha, in my Bible here, one that are from folks that I've gotten to know. One of them is the guy that got out, or well, he got off of death row. He's still incarcerated, but this little note he tells me, I was just moved off death row and I just walked on grass for the first time in 30 years. So even beyond the death penalty, I think to think this is the best that we can do when it comes to justice is like 30 years without walking barefoot on grass. And then one other thing I got in my Bible is this was John Ramirez. He was just executed, but before he was executed, I was in conversation with him, and I said, "Can I send you anything?" Like I'm thinking in my mind, prayer books or things that might be spiritual resources, and he kind of giggled and he goes, "I've got enough of those and I love them. I've been learning origami. Would you send me an origami book?" And so I've got this that he made me before he was killed. And I think those are the things that we've got to keep stirring people's their conscience with, right? So I keep those with me as a reminder, just like you, of how much is at stake.
What do you think it's going to take to put the death penalty behind us? And what do you think? What do you see as an alternative to the death penalty?
Well, I want to hear your thoughts on this too, actually. But I'm very I'm very hopeful on this because for a few reasons. I mean, I'll just throw it all out there. I'm 47 years old, but here's the deal. When I was born, most of the world was still executing people. Like over 100 countries still had the death penalty. You fast forward, less than 50 years, and most of the world has moved on from the death penalty. There's only a handful of countries that are still actively executing people. And we see that in the news right now. These are countries that are not known for their human rights, for being champions of human rights. China is the biggest executing country in the world. And then, in that top 5 are usually Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, sometimes Yemen is in there. And the US is either in the top 5 or the top 10 executing countries in the world. But even here, executions are dropping. We're fighting hard. The abolition movement's strong. We've got states like, Pennsylvania, where we've got it on the books, but we've got a moratorium. We need to shut the door on it, once and for all. So everybody needs to be, doing what they can to support the local work, because almost every year, a new state abolishes the death penalty. Virginia became the first formerly Confederate state, and historically was the state with the most executions of any state in America. If you look at the broad swipe, so that's huge for Virginia to abolish the death penalty. And there's others that are poised to do that. I'm hoping Pennsylvania will be up there soon, but we've got hard work to do. But the good news is this, like for death sentences are dropping lower every year. The opposition to the death penalty is the highest it's been in a generation. And this is interesting. There's a generational thing happening here too on many of these issues. Racial justice, the Black Lives Matter movement, gun violence, and I think of the kids in Parkland, like the environmental crisis. But on the death penalty, young people are rising up as a force for abolition. And particularly Christian young people as well. I mean, there's all kinds of different folks in this movement, but 80% of millennial Christians born after 1980, 80% are against the death penalty. So it's on its way out. But I think this is a moment where we need courage, because a generation from now, I think our children and grandchildren are going to look back like we look back at slavery, going, that was so evil and sickening. And it's so confusing that Christians were using the Bible to justify it. So I think the real question for many of us is, what role can Christians play in the abolition movement and others? I mean, but we right now, 85% of the executions, 85% are happening in the Bible Belt states with Christian governors like Governor Abbott in Texas and Governor Stitt in Oklahoma and Governor Lee in Tennessee. These are folks that are in church on Sunday. So we need people to be engaging them with, with our faith and talking about these things. And maybe even in Tennessee, we've been inviting Governor Lee to come visit Unit 2 and pray with the guys on death row. One of them, KB, I was there for his ordination when he got ordained. And on death row, he served us communion, and he's still facing execution in Tennessee. I know if Governor Stitt prayed with Kevin Burns and Kevin Burns laid hands on him and prayed for him, it would change things. So we need to keep pushing for that humanity.
You mentioned Parkland. It was interesting. He was the perpetrator was recently sentenced, and there was a lot of outrage on the part of victims' families because he was, instead of being sentenced to death, he was given a life sentence. And that was because it's in Florida, it has to be unanimous. So, and 3 jurors disagreed and refused to vote for the death penalty. But I thought that the media attention was more focused on the opposition to life without parole than, they seemed to focus on the families who wanted to see him die, which I thought was unfortunate. There was no exploration of the opposite theory. So.
Yeah, I was watching that, and I don't know if you saw this, Martha, but there was a really powerful op-ed that Reverend Sharon Risher wrote in the New York Times. And for folks that don't know Reverend Risher, I've actually got her book right here. She wrote her story in a book called For Such a Time as This. It's a powerful book. Her family were the victims in the Emmanuel AME church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. Dylan Roof went into the Wednesday night prayer meeting and killed them in the middle of their Bible study. But many of us remember how those families voiced their opposition to the death penalty. So Reverend Sharon is one of those that she's one of my dear friends and one of my heroes. But for her, it took a long time to find a way forward that felt authentic, that felt like it honored her mother, Ethel Lance, and the other victims that were killed. Because sometimes we think like, the cliche, forgive and forget. She's like, no, you forgive and you remember. Like it never goes away. But Reverend Sharon says, part of why you forgive is not so that they can sleep at night, the murderer, but so you can sleep at night, that you don't fall victim to their own hatred. And she says so powerfully, I'm going to get choked up saying it, but I've heard her say it so many times. She says, we've got to believe that God's love is bigger than Dylan Roof's hatred. And right now he is unrepentant. Dylan Roof is, he hoped to start a race war. He was fueled by racism and hatred when he did that. And at this point, he's still really got a hardened heart. But don't we want to hold out hope that this, 20-year-old man can, that the story can end differently? I think that's and I think it's so important. And part of why I quote Reverend Sharon is she's got more credibility than I do to talk to the Parkland parents, because she went through a very similar tragedy. And yet, it's so important for us that are championing alternatives to the death penalty to say, to be against the death penalty is not to be against justice, or to say that murder shouldn't have consequences, but just to say that violence is the problem, not the solution. killing another person is not going to heal the wounds of the killing that created our wounds. So that's where I think that we can say we're not going to speak the language of murder and retaliation, but there are ways that I think like people need to be protected from someone like Dylan Roof. I think at this current moment in his life, he is imminently dangerous. I hope that someone breaks through, or that God's spirit breaks through, and he's able to have a change of heart. And yet, so I think there are plenty of alternatives. Most of the world has found alternatives to executing people, even in the most atrocious crimes. And particularly when there's a period of time where you can see someone's life change, or you can, like New Zealand has redone their whole juvenile justice system. I think there's ways that we can think of restorative justice that will heal the wounds rather than kind of inflict more.
Yeah, and it seems to me that, we've created this society, as a violent one. We should be able to create a nonviolent society. I mean, we need to catch people. We need to have a more inclusive society so that people don't feel this anger that will drive them to do violent things to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of your words remind me of Mandela's words when he said, we aren't born to hate. We learn to hate. And so we can unlearn hate. We're not born to do violence. We learn in violence, and so we can unlearn it. So I think we've got to think through what will really address the root causes of that violence, and I think that's what our justice system should really be about. And so many folks dedicate their lives to restorative justice, but essentially, our criminal justice system, we're kind of conditioned to think, what did they do wrong, and what punishment do they deserve for the crime that they did? And restorative justice is asking kind of a different set of questions. It's saying, what wounds were inflicted, and what might it look like to heal those? And even the person who was a perpetrator of violence, might there be some healing that could happen in that person as well? I think as we open up our imagination to that, you see all kinds of possibilities. I think of one story I came across of a man who had he had a pattern of drinking and driving and took someone's life, a young teenager, and it wasn't a capital case. It was a vehicular homicide. And so, he had been drinking and driving, but the family, they thought, I mean, let's think outside the box a little bit, not just have him locked in a cage for the rest of his life to continually relive what he did. Let's offer him an opportunity to speak about it. And so you imagine the power of that, though, of an audience hearing not just the mom and dad that lost their, 17-year-old daughter, but you also hear the person who did that, made that mistake, that horrible mistake. And, the giving him a chance to share that might prevent someone might hear him and think twice about drinking and driving in a way that they might be moved in a different way, So I think those are the kind of things we've got to always, be thinking about together.
Yeah, and you pointed out in your book that South Africa and Rwanda have actually eliminated the death penalty and are on the road to restorative justice.
Yeah, I mean, and that was one of the things I learned when I was in South Africa, that, as apartheid fell and they're kind of reimagining their country, what's a new South Africa look like? There were a lot of things that they admired about the United States. And so they were, taking a few things, maybe spitting out some bones here and there. But one of those was the death penalty. And they said, maybe America doesn't realize it, but after apartheid, we realize it, that there is no place for the death penalty in the new South Africa. And so, ironically, they kind of moved on from the death penalty before we did.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me see if we have any questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. It was such an easy, powerful conversation, Martha. Thanks for keeping us going.
I don't see any.
I do.
Oh, go ahead.
I can read them to you.
Okay.
Has the Christian Bible ever advocated for state-sponsored violence / retaliation, or was the permission to retaliate strictly limited to individuals who had been wronged?
Say that, cap that off one more time, Martha or Kathleen. I think I'm hearing it. I just want to hear it one more time.
Sure. Has the Christian Bible ever advocated for state-sponsored violence or retaliation, or was the permission to retaliate strictly limited to individuals who had been wronged?
Oh, so yeah, I mean, there was a really clear legal process when it came to what it looked like for the Jewish people, for the Hebrew people to carry out executions. There was this big Sanhedrin of judges that, and there was a process for making that decision. There were really clear things that had to happen. And that's why, Jewish scholars point out over and over that you almost had no executions that happened. And they did, it always went, the table always tipped towards life and against execution. Even up to the very last minute, if there was any new evidence or any new person that wanted to speak against the execution, it would stop the execution. And then when you kind of fast forward into Christianity, there's absolutely no history of the death penalty in the early Christian church. I mean, there was this really deep conviction that that this was about grace, and that Jesus's death on the cross is about redemption and healing, and in as much as you forgive, you shall be forgiven, all these things. So it doesn't move at all for hundreds of years that you begin to see really what it is the proximity to power, that Christians begin to attain the power to carry out executions and war. And especially, folks talk about it as the Constantinian shift, when Constantine recognized Christianity as the imperial religion. There was a really poignant shift to where the persecuted Christians became the persecuting Christians, and literally began to exchange the cross and the love of enemy with the sword, and the killing of our enemies. And executions kind of began to happen at the hands of Christians. Incidentally, Constantine's also, I've just written a new book called Rethinking Life that comes out in a couple months, but I go into a lot of detail on this. Constantine did away with crucifixion because he made it illegal, because he thought it was offensive to Christ. And yet you think he still didn't think killing was offensive. He thought crucifixion was offensive, and I think, like, if we just kept, moving with that, that's why I thought it's so profound to me. Martha, you may remember this, that when Tennessee brought back the electric chair, they did it during Holy Week, just a few days before Easter. And I thought, my gosh, we've missed the entire point of the story. If you're bringing back the electric chair, 3 days before we remember, Jesus's death and resurrection, like, whoa. Yeah. So.
Wow. Any other questions, Kathleen?
Sure. How will murder trials be affected by jurors who are against the death penalty? Don't lawyers exclude jurors who state their opposition to the death penalty?
Yeah, I'm sure lean on Martha to share a little bit about this, but just my own personal experience. I've got jury duty tomorrow, by the way. And I was in one jury duty that was potentially for it was in a murder case. I think it was a double murder, and I didn't get a lot of the information because when it went to questioning, one of the questions I was asked was, would you ever be able to vote in favor of the death penalty or to rule in favor of the death penalty. And that's why they call, what's the language, death-worthy jurors, right? So I was eliminated from the jury, and that's a litmus test for a lot of these, right? That if you can't imagine any case that you would want the death penalty, then you're eliminated from the jury. And that's certainly a part of the problem and the bias in kind of our system as Martha, you want to say more about that?
Yeah, the tendency is to eliminate people who are in favor of life rather than death. So we get juries who are more inclined to find for the death penalty because of that, unfortunately.
I just have to hop in. Our good friend Marshall had made a recommendation as to how I might answer a question if I was ever, I've been dismissed before I got on jury several times, but I actually did get to serve twice. So Marshall says that when the prosecuting attorney says, would you be willing to sentence someone to death? His answer is, yes, if the prosecution is able to convince me that that's the appropriate punishment, then yes, absolutely. I can.
That's a good answer. Maybe I'll use that one tomorrow in jury duty, Marshall. Thanks.
Okay, now we have, can you speak to the execution of terminally ill inmates?
Well, my goodness, I don't, I don't know too much more to say on and the more that you know folks that are incarcerated, you see how much pain people are sometimes carrying, and I think sometimes it comes in the form of mental health. Sometimes, like James Coddington, I don't know that he had mental health issues, but he was abused as a child. He had family members that put liquor in his baby bottle and did all kinds of horrible things to him. And he got addicted really, really young. And that's part of what led to, he was found guilty of murdering someone that was actually a friend of his and regretted it every day of his life. So I think there's so many layers of trauma and pain. There's also all kinds of mental health struggles that people encounter. It's why veterans are also disproportionately make up many of our folks that are facing the death penalty. One of which I wrote about in Executing Grace is Babbitt, Manny Babbitt out in California. He came back from Quezon and was so traumatized by the war. His brother says he was actually put into the helicopter with the bodies of people who were casualties of the war. So he was in this space when he flew back, and he always was, jumping behind bushes and acting in kind of strange ways. And his brother heard about an incident where an elderly woman had died and thought he might have had something to do with it. And the state of California he said, I just want him to get help. If he had something to do with it, he just needs mental help. And they assured him that he wouldn't face the death penalty. But he did. And in fact, Manny, he was killed and given a decorated military funeral as the state of California executed him. And so, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, it's such a big, broad question, but it's just, you see so many different nuanced, unique narratives that are a part of people's tragic stories. And, so he needed mental health. And a lot of the states that are supporting the death penalty are cutting resources for mental health services. So this is all, if we really care about life, there's so many things that we can do better to protect it.
There's so many things wrong in Pennsylvania with the way we treat prisoners, but we now have something called compassionate release in Pennsylvania. But unfortunately, I mean, there are a lot of people who are so elderly now in the system in their 80s, and they have all sorts of physical problems as a result of poor diet and lack of exercise and so forth. And so there is this procedure for compassionate release, but it has to be applied for. You have to have a lawyer to file something in court, and it's a long drawn out process. And it's ludicrous to kill people who are in such physical shape that they can't. Well, it's ludicrous to kill people anyway, but yeah, that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, and even when people are being executed, we've seen folks that have subpoenaed John Kennedy, that have subpoenaed Jesus, that think that they're the Messiah. I mean, last year, one person said, "Don't worry about this execution. I'm coming back." And I mean, one of the things that's supposed to be true is that you're supposed to understand what's happening and have the mental health space to understand why you're being executed, what's happening, and that's just not always the case. There's folks that either because of a physical disability, one person had part of their brain removed, or it may be an actual like a psychotic mental health struggle that they have, a sickness. Yeah, so we can do so much better, right? Is just try to protect folks from someone who might be dangerous, but also to try to care for the person who might be suffering from mental health.
What alternatives are there to the death penalty that you have not already discussed? I think you had touched on folks that had received a sentence of life, and I think this one is a little bit deeper. What are the real alternatives to the death penalty?
Well, there's countries where even if you are convicted of committing a murder, that you can show that there's a process of restoration and healing and transformation, that you can be released. And some places it's 20 years, or some places it depends on how you can show that you're not going to be violent. So I think there's all kinds of possibilities like that we should leave room for, and that's where I think the restorative justice process, it's not that we've tried other things and they failed. We just haven't tried other things. We keep putting so much money and resources into a version that we call justice in the terms of the death penalty that has not been effective. It's not effective in any way. It costs more than the alternatives, even life in prison. Executing folks, it costs more. It doesn't even show any evidence of being a deterrent of crime. Police chiefs all over the country were asked, what are deterrents of crimes? It didn't even make the list. There's all kinds of other things that could deter violent crime, but the death penalty, I mean, experts over and over say, if you're going to do something that atrocious, you are in such a unhealthy space. You're not thinking, what are the consequences? You're not thinking, oh, I shouldn't do this in Missouri. They had the death penalty or something like that. It just, and if you look at the stats, it's actually those states that have continued to hold on to the death penalty, that their violent crime is just as higher than the places that have abolished it. So, and when it comes to healing the wounds, it's got this empty promise that this is for the victims, but it really sentences them to relive this thing for decades and sometimes, and promises closure, but it doesn't really bring it, and it just kind of re-traumatizes folks over and over through it, and it creates a whole new set of victims, of the person who's being executed. So I mean, I think there's lots of alternatives, that we could try. Even some of the most effective stuff that's happening in prisons is the least funded and the least scaled up to actually build, more robust programs. And there's some that I've visited inside death rows, that there's kind of a way that you can earn credits that show that you, and you can get different privileges that could eventually, I think, open the door to new possibilities other than even being incarcerated for the rest of your life. So I think there's a lot of places that are experimenting with that, but I think we need a full reimagining of our criminal justice system.
I have a question myself. I understand that there's something happening Thursday. That's a big deal. Maybe you could talk about that.
Well, I'll start us and you all can chime in, but my understanding is that for many years, the United Nations, as we've seen this kind of move towards abolition and towards alternatives to the death penalty around the globe, that there's a vote of the nations at the UN that would like to see a worldwide abolition of the death penalty and to call for that. And the United States traditionally has been, I think, a no vote and has never voted yes in favor of abolition. And we're hoping that Joe Biden will be the first vote on that, to vote with many of our peer nations to vote for abolition of the death penalty. And Joe Biden's interesting because he's someone who has flipped on this. He was for the death penalty. Most of our presidents have been for the death penalty. And his crime bill expanded the crimes that are, you can be executed for at a federal level. And that's why we're also calling on Joe Biden to call for a federal abolition of the death penalty and to demolish the federal death chamber in Terre Haute. So the first step of that is on Thursday, we'll be praying and making some phone calls and advocating and hoping for that vote from Joe Biden. And then we're going to keep pushing on that when he comes back to say that the Justice Department should stop all appeals for executions at a federal level, should abolish the federal death penalty, because it just leaves the door open. Donald Trump carried out more executions than we've seen in 100 years in the last part of his presidency. Like Joe Biden has put a moratorium on executions, but he can also do more. He can abolish the federal death chamber in Terre Haute, just like Governor Newsom he tore down the death chamber in California. So wouldn't that be something?
I think that's all the questions I see in the chat. I do have a thought for you, Shane. In light of what's happening Thursday, is there anything that we can do that might help convince the president that this is the right thing to do, to sign the covenant? Yeah,
absolutely. So everybody, thanks for listening in. It's been a powerful hour together. And on the federal level and with Joe Biden, we have a petition. I'm the chair of the advisory board for death penalty action. And if you go to death penalty action to our website, we have a petition, thousands of folks calling on Joe Biden to be even more assertive in the abolition of the death penalty. So you can see all of that. We're calling it abolition and demolition. Abolish the federal death penalty and demolish the federal death chamber. I'm sure there's probably some other things that we have on the website for Thursday as well. We just delivered a petition on that. And thanks for everybody that's supporting Witness to Innocence and Pennsylvanians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. We're working hard in our state. And please, if you're not in Pennsylvania and you're listening in, join some of these national groups, Witness to Innocence and Death Penalty Action, Journey of Hope, other groups that are working, and join the statewide work, because each state's kind of nuanced in where they're at and closing the door for all the executions to happen. So thanks, Martha, for being such a good conversation partner, and thanks for having me, Kathleen.
Thank you, Shane. We really appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Absolutely.
And that's deathpenaltyaction.org if folks want to go look for that petition.
And we're also making a film too. We're going to make a film that centers the people who have been impacted. It's called The People versus the Death Penalty. and we're funding for that right now. We've already interviewed Ron McAndrew, who was the former executioner. We've interviewed Suzanne Bossler, whose father was murdered. We're going to interview Reverend Sharon Risher. We interviewed Derek Jameson, who I've mentioned tonight. He's a part of Witness to Innocent, and Herman Lindsay, who's the, I think, new director at Witness to Innocent. So there's going to be all kinds of voices that have been impacted by the death penalty in so many different ways, so that you can see all that on our website too, and help us with the last push to make that film. Cool. Bless y'all.
Bye. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.